Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and as always, thank you for listening.
Come to France. There are a few places still on the Jefferson and France trip for October 17th and following of 2019. I'm getting so excited about it, David. It's going to be a great trip, a trip of a lifetime. I haven't been on this tour for 20 years now. Lots has happened in France, and I couldn't be more delighted to be doing it. So there are a few places left. If you ever thought of seeing France through the eyes of me, or better yet, through the eyes of the third president of the United States, now is the time. Just go to jeffersonhour.com for all of the details.
And if somebody wants to contact you personally, if they have a question about the tour, if you go to the Jefferson Hour website and click on Ask a Question, that letter will filter through and get to you, Clay.
Indeed, but France.
Okay. Myles King. Goodness, as you said and I said, this was really inspired by a couple of listeners who pointed out an article published July 3rd in the Washington Post, written by Gregory S. Schneider, titled "Saving Thomas Jefferson's Soul," and that's really the subject of this week's show. Is this 8,000-word letter he got from Myles King, a pious former sea captain from Matthews, Virginia, who had converted and become an ordained Methodist minister. He woke up thinking about Thomas Jefferson's soul at midnight one night.
You know, we can smile at that in our time, but then these were very, very serious matters.
As you said, his response to this man was so gracious. He took him seriously. He let him have it and let him know how wrong he thought he was, but he did it in such a gracious, gentlemanly way. It's pretty astounding.
I wonder what Myles King's response was when he didn't get a response from Madison. He did get this great response from Jefferson. He probably thought, yada 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 yada, and he didn't hear me. He didn't listen to me. He didn't hear how important this is. He's dismissing my point of view, and I'm sure it was upsetting to him. But Jefferson had established his views early in life. He was an anti-Trinitarian. He believed that Jesus was the greatest man who ever lived, perhaps, but certainly not the Son of God. He disbelieved in the miracles and most of the healings and the apocalyptic side of the New Testament. He regarded the Old Testament as ravings of madmen and not worth a moment's human consideration. And so if one of the 20-some Democratic candidates said this today, I'm an atheist or nearly so, I don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. I certainly don't believe he was the Christ. I can't subscribe to the notion of the Trinity. The ideas of the miracles are silly. That's probably the end of that candidacy in the 21st century.
I will go back up a bit, and according to Gregory Schneider's article in the Washington Post, Madison did reply to King. He writes, Madison's reply was brief. He thanked King for his concern, but said that letters on religious subjects, quote, have been so numerous and of characters so various that it has been an established rule to decline all correspondence on them.
That's what Jefferson should have had that printed up.
Well, Jefferson said in the conversation, he started to say Madison was smarter about this stuff than me.
He was smarter. Bertrand Russell got hundreds of thousands of letters in the course of his life, and he finally had, and this happened to George Bernard Shaw too, they finally had a bunch of responses typed up on postcards to these key questions. Are you a Christian? Why aren't you this? What do you think about women? What do you think about the atomic bomb? And then Russell would just send the postcard because it's like, this isn't my first rodeo. This is my 10,000th letter about whether I'm a Christian.
Anyway, it was a real fun conversation with Mr. Jefferson this week. We hope you enjoy it. Please go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. If you would like to support the show, there's all sorts of ways there to do it. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your correspondence, good and bad, and we encourage you to consider doing that. And also, you can find out all about Clay's cultural tours. If you have any questions about the trip to France, that's the place to get the information. And with that, sir...
Wait, but speaking of which, I want to tell you because it's the time of the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon in July of 1969. I've been grooving on these books, David, and I'm reading one now, one of the many books written by Buzz Aldrin, and he talks about the Russian space program. And before they sent a human into space, they sent a mannequin. They sent the mannequin that you would see in a store window because they wanted to see what the dynamics of pressure were on it and so on. It wasn't an attempt to defraud the world. But they also sent up a recording. They sent a recording that would be triggered at a certain moment during the flight of this experimental spacecraft. And I just read this the other night. It made me laugh out loud. One of the things that the mannequin said from orbit was that he gave a recipe for borscht soup. You know what borscht is?
Yeah, of course.
Well, not everyone does. What is borscht soup?
It's made from beets primarily.
It's beets and
cabbage,
cream,
and
cabbage.
Cream.
It's a famous Russian peasant. So they send this, zillion-dollar rocket into space with this capsule with a mannequin in it, and the mannequin speaks at a certain point, and he doesn't, recite the Communist Manifesto or speak about the one small step for humankind. He gives a recipe for borscht soup. That makes me just so happy.
It's funny.
So I'm reading all these books on the space program. That's one of the two, Winter Encampments. The other one is on Charles Dickens. I did this thing. I turned off my television. On June 4th, I turned off my television, and I haven't turned it on since. And it's been amazing. It's like, what do you do with all this free time? And so I've been reading up a storm, and it's been really tremendous. So I've been reading book after book after book on the space program and getting very, very excited. And I've been reading Dickens both in hard copy but also audiobooks. Some of the Dickens novels are read exquisitely on audio.com or other sources. And I've been reading Dombey and Son while gardening and while walking in my neighborhood and just thinking, audiobooks is one of the great inventions of our time.
It is, yeah.
So anyway, the Dickens retreat is in January. The space retreat is in January. The France trip is in October. And we are thrilled to have all of you listening. There is a book club. Our producer has told me to remind all of you that the next book in the Thomas Jefferson Hour Book Club is by Sandra Reebok, Humboldt and Jefferson. That relationship is very, very, very fascinating to me. That'll be coming up soon, and it's the number 7 on the book club list, and you must send your questions and comments by 8/19, by August 19, if you want your comments or thoughts or questions to be included in that program. Again, the book is by Sandra Reebok, Humboldt, and Jefferson. Should we listen to the show? Jefferson's reply
to Myles King,
the best snarky letter ever written to Myles King, September 26, 1814. Thanks for listening.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I confess once again I've been reading your mail, sir, and it's led me to some questions. I wonder if we might get right to the subject.
Of course.
I'd like to talk to you a bit this week, sir, about religion. Perhaps you could outline your position, your thoughts on religion, sir?
I'm very reluctant to do that. These are very private matters, and I learned at some cost to my reputation and some cost to my sleep that to enter into that world of potential controversy has a disquieting effect and often leads to severe rebukes and misunderstandings.
That may be, sir. I would say, and again, I apologize for reading your mail, but you had some firm opinions throughout your life that you shared in your correspondence.
Yes, but that correspondence was largely with very close personal friends, and if you've read the correspondence, you know how cautious I was. I would say, well, I advance these as very private thoughts only. They bear no representation of my official position as a statesman or President of the United States. I ask you not to take copies of this letter or to share it with others. It's really very important to me that this be a private communication. I feel that people's religious sensibilities are very important to them, even profoundly important, and that it's not for me as a leader or as a representative of the people to be attempting to persuade anyone of any ideas that are not known to them by themselves.
Let's look at it from a different point of view for a moment then, Mr. Jefferson. Could you tell us how important was religion to people in your time?
Very much. Most Americans were Christians of one sort or another. Most were Protestants. As you know, the peopling of New England was a Puritan and Pilgrim event. They left England because they were members of the Reformation, and at that end of the Reformation spectrum, which called for severe chastening of liturgy and church monuments and stained glass windows and vestments and so on. So the Reformation, which began with Luther in the early 16th century, was one of the most divisive events in the history of Western civilization. And in England, partly because of Henry VIII's personal life, it led to the creation of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is not that much different doctrinally from Catholicism, but it was quite different in its culture and in its attitude towards the accumulated traditions of the Catholic Church in Western civilization. So the Puritans and the Pilgrims were radical Calvinists or radical Lutherans who felt that the Anglican settlement was too moderate, too conservative. It retained too much of the Catholic settlement. And so they found themselves discontented and at odds with British official religious culture, and some of them were pushed out, and some of them left voluntarily, but they were dissenters, and dissent was not acceptable in Great Britain, at least if it were allowed or if it broke out into public actions. And so New England was peopled by such people. The rest of the country, not so much. Maryland was in many respects a Catholic colony. Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony. Virginia was more Cavalier in that it accepted the Anglican settlement, and the Episcopalian Church, our homegrown version of Anglicanism, was quite prevalent in Virginia. But in the western part of the state, beyond the Appalachians, or at least beyond the Blue Ridge, you had Scots-Irish Presbyterians who were Calvinists of another sort, and then we had Moravians and the beginnings of what would become Methodism and Anabaptists and a whole range of other sects. So we had a pretty widely diverse religious culture, but the fact is that of the, say, 6 million American people, when I became president on March 4th, 1801, the overwhelming majority of them were Judeo-Christian in origins, Christian in faith. Probably 8/10 of them or more, maybe 9/10 of them were Protestants of one sort or another.
It's interesting you bring up those statistics. I sure looked up to find out how many Americans today regard themselves as Christians. And the most recent poll I could find is not quite 5 years old. It says 75% of polled American adults identify themselves as Christians. So you would say that it was even a higher percentage during your time. Is that correct?
I do believe so. So one of the things that I misunderstood was human religious energy. I'm a rationalist. I believe that reason is our only oracle. I believe the Creator gave us this capacity, rationality, what's known as ratiocination, our ability to reason, our skepticism, our ability to weigh evidence for its likeliness. I think that's the greatest gift that the Creator gave us, and I tried to follow the dictates of reason all of my life. And so I was myself what you would call a deist and a Unitarian, although I kept those convictions very quiet. And I said late in life that I thought within about 50 years, every young American would be a Unitarian. So I was clearly wrong here. One of the blindnesses in my vision, my outlook, was that I did not understand how strong the religious sensibility is and how much continuity there was. And it turns out, we were not about to make a transference into a rationalist Unitarian culture. In fact, towards the end of my life, something called the Second Great Awakening occurred, and it was a religious revival that swept the frontier and, to a certain degree, our cities. I could not have predicted that. That's exactly the opposite of where I thought a culture of science and skepticism was headed. So I'm not a very good prophet with respect to the history of religion in this country.
Well, I know that you received many inquiries from people about religion, sir, and as I stated before, there are many letters that exist that you wrote on the subject. In 1787, August 10th, you wrote to Peter Carr, quote, "Fix reason firmly in her seat, and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." I'm curious, where did these beliefs come from?
I grew up as an Anglican in Virginia. Everyone on the Atlantic side of the mountains was Anglican, more or less. My first teachers were clergymen, Anglican priests, who during their spare time took students in a tutorial system and taught them. I imbibed all of that the way one does the culture of one's childhood without really thinking about it very much. But I had my doubts. From a fairly early time, I was always encouraged to think for myself.
That's what I wondered, sir. Was this something that you came up with, that you deduced on your own?
No. It really came partly from my father, Peter Jefferson, who died when I was 14, but he had a library of about 40 volumes, and he was a self-taught man, and he encouraged me to take learning seriously, that this wasn't just finishing school before you get on with adulthood, that it's formational for a man's life. And then I went up to the College of William and Mary when I was just short of 17 years old, and I was there for about 2.5 years. And fortunately, my primary lecturer, tutor there, was a man named William Small from England. He had been a member of the famous Lunar Society near Birmingham in England. And he was a free thinker and a rationalist and a man of the Enlightenment. And although he was there to teach mathematics, because of some vacancies in the faculty and some scandals, he wound up teaching a whole range of things. And I became his favorite pupil and his young friend and protege. And it was he, William Small, who set the destinies of my life by saying, question everything, be skeptical, think for yourself, use reason. Don't accept something merely because it's always been or because people say that it's true. Ask yourself the hard questions about any idea, whether it's religious or economic or political or agricultural or whatever. And he gave me confidence. If he had been a devout Presbyterian, like James Witherspoon up at Princeton, or if he had been a Congregationalist, like Timothy Dwight up at Yale, my formation might have been much more traditionally Christian. But I was lucky that in little faraway Williamsburg, this outpost of empire, there was a professor who came straight out of the heart of the Scottish and English Enlightenment and who believed that reason and skepticism are the hallmarks of a complete human being. And so that really is perhaps the pivotal moment of my upbringing.
You also had, it would seem, sir, a belief of privacy. In other words, it's no one's business. You wrote to the Danbury Baptists.
This is January 1st, 1802.
There's a very famous letter, but one line of it, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. In other words, it's between an individual and God. It's not something for public knowledge.
No, we pray and we have our own private religious activities in our homes or our churches. But these are not public matters. These are private matters. And when we created a social compact, we did not empower it to coordinate our religious sensibilities. We empowered it to raise taxes and to levy an army and to make coinage and to have foreign policy and so on. But we never empowered government to tell us what to think or what God, if any, to believe in. These are private matters. They're sovereign. They're off limits. They don't belong to government. And any government that tries to interfere in that is tyrannical by definition.
The wall of separation.
In that letter, I said when I contemplate the First Amendment, I see a wall of separation between church and state.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break from our conversation. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. We're speaking with Mr. Jefferson this week about religion, some of his personal beliefs. And sir, I thank you for sharing them. I know it is a private matter.
Very much so. I have strong views, and I can summarize them very quickly by saying reason is at the center of it. And as I said to my nephew Peter Carr, we should look upon Christianity, Old Testament and New, in the same way we would look on anything else. We don't necessarily need to believe that book, the Bible, is the inspired Word of God or God writing it himself. We should look upon it as a book, like other books, perhaps more important than other books, but we should not be awestruck or have our critical capacities disarmed by its hoary tradition as one of the most important books in the history of the world. So reason, again, is the tool we use. So given that, if you look at the New Testament and you see the miracles, it seems to me that Jesus could not have walked on water. Except in some very metaphoric sense, he could not have turned water into wine at a wedding. He almost certainly could not quell a storm on the Sea of Galilee. And he certainly could not have raised Lazarus from the dead. I mean, that's a simple absurdity. And so if you go through all the things that Jesus is said to have done and say, how rational is that? How likely is that? How does that square with Newtonian mechanics? Is that possible under our understanding of chemistry or physics? Is there another explanation for this? Can this be seen metaphorically? Because it's hard to accept it literally. If you use that set of criteria, not much is going to survive. What does survive is that it's almost certain that this man Jesus lived. It is quite clear that he was a charismatic and that he was a very persuasive rabbi. It's certain that he confronted and challenged the Jewish establishment to the point that he drove the Pharisees and the Sadducees to distraction over his radical teaching. He, in my opinion, did not believe that he was the Son of God, at least until the very end of his ministry. He taught these things which changed the nature of Judaism from a formalistic, legalistic set of codes. There are hundreds of commandments in the Old Testament. He changed it from that into a more spiritual religion, and he said it's not so much what we do, although that's very important, of course, but it's what our impulses are. It's what our heart is telling us. It's what's going on inside of us. And he said, until you address the sins and the darkness in your heart, just complying with outward law is not sufficient. You must have there must be a purity. There must be a new innocence in your way of seeing others, including your enemies, or you can't get into heaven. And in doing that, he carried ethics from outside, as the Jewish world had seen it, compliance with laws, into the interior of the human consciousness and soul and said, examine yourself. What's going on in your impulses? Do you lust after that woman? Do you hate that fellow? Do you find it hard to forgive somebody who has trespassed against you? And until you can overcome those dark, selfish, narcissistic, vengeful, reptilian energies, you are not saved. You're not going to get into heaven by meeting the Sabbath and sacrificing the right animals and harmonizing with the dietary codes of Judaism. And this, of course, shocked and angered and outraged the Jewish establishment, and then they conspired with the Roman occupational authority to have this fellow removed by way of the most humiliating of public executions, crucifixion. And so that's the basis of it. What he said can be distilled from the four Gospels. Not all of what the Gospels say he said can be authentic, but you can go through with a pretty sure sense of what are the authentic sayings of this great Rabbi Jesus and what are interpolations or things that are attributed to him and so on.
Yes, and I know you did that in creating your own personal Bible.
As a private meditation, yes.
Back to the letters, sir. There are two more that I would like to touch on.
Yes, sir.
One came from May of 1813. You wrote to Richard Russ and said essentially that you, quote, considered religion as, quote, a matter between every man and his maker, in which no other, and far less the public, had a right to intermeddle. But the public did. They were aware of your beliefs, and there were people who took exception to that, which brings me to the last letter, sir. And I'm certain you must remember it. It certainly must have taken the better part of a day to read it. In the fall of 1814, you got a very lengthy letter from Mr. Myles King. Do you recall?
Yes, indeed.
Do you remember anything about him? Could I refresh your memory?
Well, I would be eager for your summary, but I do remember this, that he, like many others, worried about my salvation, and he was praying for me, and he feared that if the reports of my deistic and free-thinking ways were true, that I was in jeopardy of eternal damnation, and he wanted to do whatever he could to persuade me to think again about my religious convictions. Is that fair?
That's very fair. He was worried for your soul, sir. He was a sea captain who was quite prosperous and lived a life of, I think, he used the word debauchery.
Oh my, so there's a sinner if he's telling the truth.
His first wife died, he remarried, and his second wife convinced him to attend church, and he eventually became a Methodist minister.
Well, in many cases, I had received hundreds of these letters in the course of my lifetime, and of course there were op-ed pieces and public sermons, and even some state legislatures debated my religious views, and my normal attitude towards all this was simply to ignore it. And when I replied, I often replied in a very brisk and brief way, merely sort of saying these are matters between a man and his creator.
But you chose to answer Myles King's letter, and I was unaware of this letter, sir. I provided you a copy of it. It's quite an extraordinary piece of work, sir.
Well, thank you. You can see from the letter that I'm attempting to say essentially, thanks. I appreciate your concern. It's misplaced. I'm old enough to know what my convictions are. I want you not to be concerned about my salvation. And in fact, my test of religion is a man's behavior, that if a man's life has been wicked, then whatever religion he espouses can't have done much good. And if a man's life has been good or exemplary, then whatever religion is the basis of it must be the right one.
Well, his letter it's difficult to read. It's a lot of dogma. Pardon me, sir.
His letter to me.
Yes, it is, and it's not as if he has used his own mind to reason these things out. He's repeating beliefs that have been given to him. Is what I got.
Well, that's what happens. Is that from our childhood we imbibe a set of views that come from our priest or preacher or rabbi or mullah. And most of us stay within that set of bounds for the rest of our life with some small adjustments. And we accept these things as given or on faith, and we don't question them very much. And when we have public discussion or public disputes, we trot out our views and articulate them, but without ever stepping back to say, I wonder how this holds up against the tests of reason and skepticism.
He writes about our nation receiving all the blessings of God and then paying him with what he calls the blackest ingratitude, and we've continued to sin with a high hand. He was worried about the nation and about you, Mr. Jefferson.
I do believe in providence. That doesn't mean that I think that God sided with us in our revolution or that he prefers candidate A to candidate R. But I do think there is providence. I think God is a benevolent being, that he does exist, that he has a consciousness, that he looks down upon us. He does not interfere. He doesn't help my crops grow or smite the French during the Revolution. But he thinks well of us. We are the top of the chain of being. We're his supreme creation. He takes a particular pride and wants our happiness. And he observes all of this. I'm sure there are times when this being, I'm using a metaphor here, but cringes and wrings his hands about the follies of humankind. But he gave us the tools to create progress. He gave us reason and good sense and certain sensibilities like a lively sense of justice, sympathy for those who are in pain, the generosity of spirit, and so on. So these are the tools the Creator gave us, and I think he thinks well of the American experiment, but I don't think that he thinks the American experiment is to be preferred, say, to what's happening in Greece or what's happening in Finland.
Then you took the time to write him back, 26 September 1814. As I said, I've given you a copy of the letter. Would you be willing to read parts of it and perhaps explain in detail what you were trying to convey to Mr. Myles?
I can make an attempt at it. Let me read the first paragraph of the letter. And I guess what I would ask all of you to do is to listen to the carefulness of the sentences and the caution and the unwillingness to offend, but also the unwillingness to yield. I regarded this as a very important moment, and I wanted to get it right. I wanted to be clear and plain. I didn't want to be offensive, and I didn't want to be defensive about my own views. So here's how it begins. Sir, I duly received your letter of August 20, and I thank you for it, because I believe it was written with kind intentions and a personal concern for my future happiness. Whether the particular revelation which you suppose to have been made to yourself were real or imaginary, your reason alone is the competent judge. For, dispute as long as we will on religious tenets, our reason at last must ultimately decide, as it is the only oracle which God has given us to determine between what really comes from him and the phantasms of a disordered or deluded imagination.
So you're saying to him, we must reason these things. Am I right?
And I'm saying that I'm not doubting his revelation. That's none of my business.
He's very polite.
And I'm not disputing him. I'm saying I have to use my reason, which is the only tool the Creator has given me, and then I have to determine when I look at, say, the contents of your letter or the doctrines of the Baptist Church or whatever, I have to look at them and decide which of these things are phantasms of a disordered or deluded imagination, or which are possibly a revelation from God himself.
Mr. Myles, in his letter, talks about waking up at midnight with this great fear for your soul and the nation and thinking about what to do. And then a month later, it happened to him again, and he sort of took that as a sign from God that he needed to reach out to you, to write you this letter.
Right. I'm implying in a very gentle way here that these are probably phantasms of his night dreams and indigestion, but I wouldn't have ever said that in a bold way. I go on, you believe you have been favored with such a special communication from God. Your reason, not mine, is to judge of this, and if it shall be his pleasure to favor me with a like admonition, I shall obey it with the same fidelity with which I would obey his known will in all cases. In other words,
depending on the tone that was read in, it could be misconstrued as a bit patronizing.
I don't think so. I'm saying if God wants to speak to me,
I believe you.
I'm standing by with my ears open. But until such time, I do not necessarily have to accept that you had a revelation from God. Who knows where it might have come from?
And then we get to the heart of the matter in the next paragraph, sir.
Well, I say that reason is my guide, and then I pick it up there. I have followed it, reason, faithfully in all important cases, to such a degree at least as leaves me without uneasiness. And if on minor occasions I have erred from its dictates, that is, the dictates of reason, I have trust in him who made us what we are, and knows it was not his plan to make us always unerring. He has formed us as moral agents, not that in the perfection of his state he can feel pain or pleasure from anything we may do, he is far above our power, but that we may promote the happiness of those with whom he has placed us in society by acting honestly towards all, benevolently to those who fall within our way, respecting sacredly their rights bodily and mental, and cherishing especially their freedom of conscience as we value our own. And then this, a key sentence which I repeat in different ways in different moments through the course of my life. And so I pick it up there. I must ever believe that religion substantially good which produces an honest life, and we have been authorized by one whom you and I equally respect to judge of the tree by its fruit. Amen. I mean, that's the sum total of my view of religion and social life. If the fruits of our life, our behavior, the way we treat others, the way we treat our children, our sense of civic responsibility, our basic honesty and integrity, our capacity for generosity of spirit and sympathy, if those things are honorable and exemplary, then that's the test. And even if you know as much about Christian doctrine as Tertullian and St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas combined, and you lead a vicious, selfish, mean-spirited, exploitative life, then that religious doctrine obviously has not percolated very deeply into your soul.
Would you please, sir, read one more paragraph, the following?
I go on. Our particular principles of religion are a subject of accountability to our God alone. I inquire after no man's, and trouble none with mine.
Yes, sir. It is a very kind gesture of you to take so much time to write this gentleman back.
Well, I care about people, and they certainly care about me, and as a public figure, by now I had been retired for 6 years, but as a public figure, I knew that I had a special responsibility and that I couldn't be dismissive of other people, even when I might privately have felt that they were meddling unnecessarily in something that was none of their business.
That, I guess, was the point that struck me, is that religion is private. It is between a person and their maker, and nobody else's business.
Right. And, if I had been Hamilton, I might have said, you might spend more time thinking about your own past and less about mine. But that was not my style.
Mr. Madison received a letter from Myles King, and he declined to answer, sir.
Well, Madison is a wiser man than I. But, I always use these occasions to try to step back and to think and to reassess my life. Our minds do change somewhat in the course of life. And then to find a way to say something, I won't say imperishable, but something that has a chance of being bigger than just a reply. And that's what I was doing here.
I think you could say imperishable. Thank you so much for a fine conversation, Mr. Jefferson.
May you find revelation where you seek it, but leave me to my own rationality.
Indeed, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This is Clay Jenkinson. I have removed my wig and tights. I am in the barn here at the New Enlightenment Radio Network Center in North Dakota. And across from me is the semi-permanent guest host of the Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
Great letter to talk to. Mr. Jefferson was on the mark this week. Before we go any farther, I need to point out that I'd say 3 or 4 listeners called our attention to an article written by Gregory Schneider that appeared July 3rd in the Washington Post, and it's titled "Saving Thomas Jefferson's Soul." And he discusses this letter from Myles King, and I wanted to make sure that we credit that.
Let me say this much about this, David, that when I read this letter, and I don't recall having read it before, maybe I have, but it came as kind of a surprise to me. I was swept away at how beautiful and gracious it is, how generous, how respectful, how nuanced, how careful, how civil.
But the big thing to me is, did you take time to read the Myles King letter?
Yes, of course.
It is one of the more difficult things I've ever had to read. And I can't imagine Jefferson going through this, but I'm certain he did.
But let me return to my theme. This is an exquisite letter written by one of the most thoughtful and civilized people who ever lived on earth, filled with a beautiful caution and gracefulness, not wishing to offend, but wishing to be clear, taking another person's point of view seriously, but not yielding to it, making his own position known, but in a humble and modest and what is known as a diffident way. Well, you know what's coming. If you just fast forward, imagine that the current President of the United States received a letter from Myles King. Imagine the reply. And that's all I need to say.
There's some beautiful prose in Jefferson's letter. But again, we come back to that individualism of it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg.
The famous statement from Notes on the State of Virginia that got him into so much trouble. I want to go back to the beginning of the letter. You know, Jefferson basically says, in matters of revelation and religion, reason is our only tool. Well, you know, any serious Christian theologian, were she or he sitting here, would say that's nuts. If that's your tool, you're never going to get anywhere. That, you know, Tertullian, the famous Latin church father, said, "I believe because it's absurd." Reason can't be your only tool if you want to come to terms with Christianity and not wind up removing large parts of it, which is what men of the Enlightenment and Thomas Jefferson did. In other words, he's a friend of mine who's an eminent Catholic theologian would say, this isn't a fair game. If Jefferson is saying you take the miracle of the loaves and fishes and just apply a kind of Newtonian scientific skepticism to it, then you may as well just start with a razor blade cutting whole swaths of the Bible out and throwing them away. There's nothing to be gained there. That reason can't be the tool. Reason is an important tool. Aquinas told us that. Thomas Aquinas gave his whole amazing medieval career to trying to bring Aristotelian reason to Christian revelation and to show that they can be squared, that they can live in the same equation. But any serious Christian thinker would say Jefferson doesn't have a chance to be a Christian once he says that you test the raising of Lazarus against reason and say, could this have happened?
I love the bit about the phantasms of a disordered or deluded imagination.
Yeah, that's as close as he gets to being snarky.
And it's kind of a nice way to say that your stream of consciousness letter is sort of bunk.
Well, or what happens to you in the middle of the night somewhere on a ship or in a house in Nantucket is hardly worth giving serious attention to by someone you've never met, who lives in another place and whose views you probably don't know with any completeness or sophistication. Jefferson is basically saying, look, these are your dreams. You're entitled to them. I'm guessing God's not talking to you. And he goes on to say, and by the way, if God wants to help me, he's going to contact me. And when he does, I'm going to listen. But I don't think he's going to do it.
The religious beliefs are, quote, a subject of accountability to our God alone. I inquire after no man's and trouble none with mine. So it's kind of like, I don't want to say that's snarky either, but it's like, keep it to yourself.
It's really a private matter. He's, again, I go back, exquisite, graceful, civil, respectful, but firm and unyielding. And I think that's absolutely magnificent. Thank goodness we had a president who could write to the Danbury Baptists in the way that Jefferson did. Thank goodness we had a president who could write to Myles King in the way that he did. Jefferson's just incredibly refined human consciousness is rare amongst any presidents in American history, and rarer, of course, as time goes on. How many presidents can you say are graceful? Well, Ronald Reagan could be graceful at times. John Kennedy, thanks to Theodore Sorensen, could be graceful at times. There have been some. Lincoln, probably the most graceful person who ever served as president of the United States, and it was no speechwriters there. The second inaugural address is one of the world's handful of greatest single documents, but it's a rare quality, and so for this letter deserves a much wider presence in the Jefferson literature than it has received.
We'll post Jefferson's letter to Myles King on the Thomas Jefferson Hour webpage. That's jeffersonhour.com. You can go there and find out a lot more about the show. You can support the show if you so choose, and we appreciate that. I thank you, Mr. Jenkinson, for a fine conversation this week. But it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
I understand taking down statues of Confederate generals, especially those put up during the Civil Rights Movement to reassert white Southern pride and a grim determination to perpetuate Jim Crow laws as long as possible. I can even understand taking down statues of Robert E. Lee, though I personally have always seen him as a tragic figure, not as an unreconstructed Southerner, but I'm a white guy living in North Dakota. But shall we now remove Thomas Jefferson's statue from the campus of Columbia University because he was a slaveholder, an apartheidist, and the sexual possessor of Sally Hemings? Is it okay to deface his statue at the College of William and Mary, of which he was an alum, in which he tried to reform during his time as the governor of Virginia? What about what used to be called in hushed tones Mr. Jefferson's University at Charlottesville, Virginia? Should we erase Jefferson from the university he created in his retirement? And now Theodore Roosevelt. Well, it is true that the Rough Rider said some pretty hard-to-digest things about the righteousness of conquering the American West and crushing Native American resistance to the manifest destiny of the white Anglo-Saxon peoples of the world. He said some nasty things about American Indians. Should his statue be plucked down from its pedestal in front of the American Museum of Natural History in New York? T.R.'s father, Thee, was one of the founders of that amazing institution, and T.R. himself contributed hundreds of specimens to its collections from his hunts on several continents. In the statue in question, T.R. does appear to be leading Aboriginal people, more or less by the scruff, to the joys of civilization. Where does it end? I call this the de-Stalinization of America. If we are going to topple the statues of everyone who was complicit in slavery, that's all the Founding Fathers, but especially Patrick Henry, George Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, John Marshall, and of course the individual who wrote All Men Are Created Equal. 8 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. Think about that. Abraham Lincoln himself, the great emancipator, had very serious doubts about the capacity of black people. He did not believe white people needed to mingle with them, and he was a supporter at times of repatriation and deportation movements. He'd be called an apartheidist today, although he had some of the most important redeeming virtues of any president. Where does it end? If the focus is on Native Americans, well, all of us who aren't Indians are squatting on their sovereign lands, and in many cases the tribes simply reject any notion that they sold or ceded those lands during the 19th century. Easy enough to pluck down a statue of Custer, but are we prepared to give back significant chunks of the Black Hills to the Sioux and the Cheyenne with interest, or to breach some of the dams that devastated the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Lakota? There are scores of places in the American West named after George Armstrong Custer, but he is only the easiest and most obvious target of revisionism. Lewis and Clark will have to be imploded. There are scores of statues to them nationwide. And George Rogers Clark must go, and of course the notorious Andrew Jackson, and John C. Fremont, and Isaac Stevens, and Senator Thomas Hart Benton, and Horace Greeley, who told America's restless young men to go west. If you really want to de-Stalinize America along the lines of our current understanding of enlightenment, you're going to be stripping the continent bare. Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol is going to be a pretty lonely place for Washakie, Winnemucca, Sequoia, Pope, and Sacagawea. The rest will be in storage lockers in West Virginia. And almost surely Stone Mountain in Georgia is going to have to be sandblasted away, and Mount Rushmore will need to be reduced to rubble. Let me say this with candor. I do not see how Thomas Jefferson can survive this spasm of righteousness and outrage. If Robert E. Lee must go, so too the Sage of Monticello. Are we really prepared to cleanse the continent with ruthless consistency? This is beginning to sound a bit like Robespierre in the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we should give these historical figures a pass just because they did great things in their lives. I welcome the strong and growing national conversation we are having about the oppression, the racism, the misogyny, the white nationalism of American history. And I think some, perhaps many, of these statues should be quietly lowered to the ground and stored away in museum archives. I'm not against removing statues and memorials now considered offensive, but I think we should be cautious, not precipitous. I'd be more comfortable with counter-memorials or counter-signage along the lines of, when this statue of Stonewall Jackson was put up in 1962, Alabama was seething with racial tension. The decades of Jim Crow, lynching, and separate but equal were being challenged in the courts and on the streets. This statue was put up in defiance by the Daughters of the Confederacy. No African Americans were on the committee. The dedication was attended by George Wallace, who said, "Segregation now, segregation forever." Stonewall Jackson, who was indeed a superb Confederate general, also owned 132 slaves and said once, "Black people were made to carry burdens." Such sentiments reflect centuries of systematic repression, enslavement, and racism. Fortunately, we have come a long way. The overwhelming majority of Alabamans now repudiate such views. Something like that for new signage alongside the statue. I see every offensive monument as an invitation to a new, more historically rigorous set of interpretive panels. Jefferson famously said, "For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it." I see each of these crises as a teaching opportunity, to teach the children of oppressors how blind and self-serving their kin have been, and the children of the oppressed that we are determined to face our problematic history directly, unblinkingly, without defensiveness, and without having our feelings hurt by people we have hurt 100,000-fold. I'm with Hamlet. Use every man after his desert, and who shall scape whipping? Polonius in Hamlet says we are a little soiled in the working. There are very few saints. Each of my Chautauqua heroes, Jefferson, Roosevelt, Meriwether Lewis, John Wesley Powell, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Walter Raleigh, John Steinbeck, would have a hard time facing the devil's advocate at a hearing for sainthood, some more than others. But they are great men nevertheless, and each of them, in my view, contributed so much to civilization that it outweighs their very real faults. I subscribe to the whole man theory, that any life needs to be seen in the broad context of the times in which she or he lived, the dominant social, political, and economic mores of the times, and that individual's overall life experience and achievement. The less savory aspects of that life should no longer be ignored or papered over or explained away. That was a habit of American historiography for a very long time, and it is still the preferred method of cultural conservatives like Dinesh D'Souza, William Bennett, Oliver North, or Lynn Cheney. We must learn to tell the truth, the whole truth, the unvarnished truth. But that is a task for all of us, not just political and social activists and those who sit on cultural committees. If you want to see it done right, perhaps perfectly, go to the Thomas Jefferson exhibit in the new National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Every American should spend a day at that magnificent facility. My point is that we can do this. We can do this right. We can use this national monuments crisis to deepen and widen and contextualize our understanding of our rich, troubled, unresolved story, few moments of which are purely good or purely evil, though there are some of both. Let's slow down and think about this. Let's find creative ways to wrestle the great problematic history of America to the ground. Let's talk this out in a nuanced, thoughtful, generous way. And let's not be afraid to come to some unpopular and perhaps unpalatable conclusions. In my view, plucking down Saddam Hussein's statue with ropes and tackle provides only a very temporary satisfaction. What follows in that void, history shows, is often not much better than what we swept away. Context, context, context. Judgment is easy, understanding is hard. Or as Jefferson put it, every human being must be viewed according to what it is good for none of us, no, not one, is perfect. And were we to love none who had imperfections, this world would be a desert for our love. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.